Chapter 31. The most valuable skill Dorian ever learned turned out to be a simple one. He figured out how to eat and drink without breaking his trance. Instead of having Solon watch him for the inevitable signs of dehydration and wake him, Dorian was able to maintain his trances for weeks. Though he knew he appeared utterly disconnected from reality, the opposite was true. From his little room in the garrison at Screaming Winds, Dorian watched everything. The Cenarian garrison at Screaming Winds had been bypassed by Calidor's invasion. Most of the Calidorian army had simply used Corrid's Pass, more than a week east. With the death of Logan's father, Duke Regnus Geyer, the garrison was being led by a young noble named Leroy Voss. He was well-meaning, but he didn't know what to do without a commanding officer. Solon was giving advice that over the days sounded less like advice and more like orders. If Calidor attacked Screaming Winds now, they would attack from the Cenarian side, so he shifted the defenses, moved the men and the supplies within the walls. No one expected an attack, though. The truth was that Screaming Winds now protected nothing. Gareth Ursel could let them grow old and die here, and all he would lose would be a trade route that hadn't been used for hundreds of years. Far to the south, Fear was doing less well, though he was tracking Kurach admirably. Fear had a hard row in front of him, and Dorian could do nothing to make it easier. Sometimes it made Dorian sick. He'd watch Fear die a dozen ways, some of them so shameful he wept even through his trance. At best, Fear would have about 2 decades and a heroic death in front of him. As always, Dorian strayed close to his own futures. He'd found a way to do it that didn't risk madness. He simply watched the futures of other people at the places they met him. It didn't work well, though. He would see 6 ways a person might interact with him and how their choices might affect the meeting, but not his own. So he could see what, but not why. He couldn't follow a single line of his own choices to see where it would lead him. Once in a while, he could watch his own face through other people's eyes and guess what he was thinking, but those were rare flashes. It was taking too long, even with his trance stretching over a month, and while he pieced his own life together, everything else changed. So he'd started touching his own life directly. He knew several things instantly. First, he was going to be a source of either hope or despair for tens of thousands within a year. Second, a gaping hole stretched across his possible futures. He traced it back and realized the hole was because in some paths he would choose to renounce his gift of prophecy. He was stunned. He'd thought of it before, of course. In all his training with the healers, disabling his gift was the only cure he'd been able to find for his growing madness. But Dorian's gift had seemed a gift for the whole world, and he'd gladly borne the consequences because he knew he'd be able to help others avert disaster. Third, Kali herself was coming to Screaming Winds. Dorian's heart dropped into his stomach. If she passed the garrison, she would go to Cenaria and take up residence in the hellish jail they called the Maw. Gareth Ursel would have 2 of his sons build Ferali. He would use one against the rebel army. There would be a massacre. Callie and her entourage were still 2 days away. Dorian had time. He looked back at his own life, trying to figure out how to avert disaster. In a moment, he was swept up in the current. Faces streamed past him, became a maelstrom, sucking him down. His young wife crying, a girl hanged, a little village in northern Wadron where he might live with Fear's family, a red-haired boy who was like a son to him 15 years from now, killing his brothers, betraying his wife, telling his wife the truth and losing her, a gold mask of his own face weeping golden tears, marching with an army, Nefdada, walking away from an army, solitude and madness and death 12 different ways. Down every path he could see only suffering. Every time he chose any good for himself, those he loved suffered. "You knew," his wife asked. "You knew all along." "No!" Dorian shot upright in bed, waking. Solon flinched in the chair across from Dorian. He gestured, and the lamps in the room lit. "Dorian?" "You're back! I hope whatever you were doing was important, because I wanted to wake you about 100 times. Dorian's head was aching. What day was it? How long had he been catatonic? His answer was in the air itself. Kali was close. He could feel her. "I need gold," Dorian said. "What?" Solon asked. He rubbed his eyes. It was late. "Gold, man! I need gold!" Solon pointed to his purse on the table and pulled on boots. Dorian spilled the gold coins into his hands. It barely even hit his palm before the coins melted into a glob, instantly cooled and wrapped around his wrist. "More, more! There's no time to lose, Solon." "How much?" "As much as you can carry. Meet me in the back courtyard, and rouse the soldiers, all of them, but don't ring the alarm bell." Damn it, what is it? Solon demanded. He grabbed his sword belt and strapped it on. No time! Dorian was already running out of the room. In the courtyard, Dorian could swear he smelled Callie even more strongly, though the scent was purely magical. She was perhaps 2 miles distant. It was midnight now, and he suspected she'd strike an hour before dawn, the witching hour, when men are most susceptible to the night terrors and Kali's delusions. Dorian tried to untangle what he'd seen. He couldn't imagine the garrison would hold, and if Callie caught him, the results would be as terrible for the world as for him. A prophet delivered into her hands? Dorian thought of the futures he'd seen before himself. Was it so great a sacrifice to give up seeing those rush inexorably toward him? But if he gave up his visions, he would be blind, rudderless, and useless to anyone else. It also wasn't a simple procedure. He described it to Solon in fear as being like smashing his own brain with a sharp rock in order to stop seizures. Ideally, he could sear one part of his own talent in such a way that it would eventually heal, but not for years. If Callie captured him, she might think his gift was gone forever and kill him. He had begun preparing the weaves before he realized he'd made up his mind. The fact that it was dark and he couldn't replenish his Glorvorden was no problem because the amount of magic he needed was slight. He set up the weaves deftly, sharpening some and setting them aside, holding the prepared potions as if in one hand. As the magic came together, he realized that all his time in his visions, juggling different streams of time and holding place markers at decision points, had paid off in his magic. Not 5 years ago he'd come this far with the weave, practicing it to see if he could hold even 7 strands simultaneously. It had been brutal, especially knowing that letting any one slip could make him an amnesiac, an idiot, or dead. Now it was easy. Solon came into the yard and saw what he was doing, a look of horror on his face, and even that didn't distract Dorian. He sliced, twisted, pulled, seared, and covered one section of his talent. The courtyard was curiously silent, strangely flat, oddly constricting. My God, Dorian said. What? Solon asked, his eyes full of concern. What have you done? Dorian was disoriented, like a man trying to stand after losing a leg. Solon, it's gone. My gift is gone.